Imagine two of the greatest powers of the ancient world, locked in a struggle so massive it reshaped the destiny of Greece forever. On one side, Athens, a glittering democracy, naval powerhouse, and center of art, philosophy, and innovation. On the other side, Sparta, a land of warriors, discipline, and unbreakable tradition, whose soldiers were trained from childhood to fight and die for their city-state. For nearly 30 years, these two titans waged war, not just with armies and ships, but with ideology, culture, and sheer willpower. This was not a single battle, but a drawn-out conflict that tested every corner of the Greek world, a war of plagues, betrayals, and shifting fortunes. This is the story of the Peloponnesian War, a war that ended the golden age of Greece, shattered alliances, and left scars that echo through history. We will journey through its causes, its bloodiest battles, its political intrigues, and its devastating consequences. You'll hear about the brilliant strategies, the tragic downfalls, and the ordinary lives caught in the crossfire of Athens and Sparta. Seeds of rivalry. The roots of the Peloponnesian War stretch back decades before the first spear was thrown. Greece in the 5th century BCE had just emerged victorious from the Persian Wars, where Athens and Sparta had stood side by side to defend their homeland. But victory bred rivalry. Athens, flush with power, turned its naval strength into the Delian League, an alliance meant to keep Persia at bay. Slowly, that league transformed into an Athenian empire, with tribute flowing into the city, and monumental projects like the Parthenon rising on the Acropolis. To Athens, this was leadership. To Sparta, it was domination. Sparta, the head of the Peloponnesian League, viewed Athens with growing suspicion. Unlike the naval democracy of Athens, Sparta was a land-based oligarchy, conservative, wary of change, and devoted to its unique way of life. To Spartans, the glittering festivals and intellectual debates of Athens were signs of weakness, distractions from true discipline. To Athenians, Spartan society was harsh, closed, and archaic. These cultural differences hardened into political rivalry, especially as smaller Greek states were forced to choose sides between the two giants. By the middle of the 5th century, tensions had erupted into smaller conflicts known as the First Peloponnesian War. Although it ended with a shaky truce, neither side truly trusted the other. The peace was fragile, and underneath it simmered resentment, ambition, and fear. Both Athens and Sparta believed the other threatened their freedom, and both were right. The spark of war? The fragile peace finally collapsed in 431 BCE. The immediate sparks came from disputes involving smaller states, particularly Corinth, a proud naval power, aligned with Sparta. Athens had interfered in disputes involving Corinth's colonies, sending ships to aid Corcyra, a colony rebelling against Corinth. To Sparta, this was aggression, a dangerous sign that Athens intended to dominate the seas unchecked. Corinth pushed hard for Sparta to respond. At the same time, Megara, another Spartan ally, was suffering under the Athenian-imposed Megarian decree, which strangled its economy by excluding it from Athenian markets. These grievances piled up until the Spartans called their allies together and debated whether to declare war. The vote was clear. Sparta and its allies would go to war to check Athenian expansion. Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, did not shrink from the challenge. Pericles argued that Athens' naval superiority meant Sparta could not win, and advised the Athenians to avoid land battles, shelter behind their city walls, and let their fleet strike across the seas. This set the stage for the war's opening years, a clash not only of armies, but of strategies, economies, and endurance. The war begins. In 431 BCE, Sparta marched into Attica, ravaging the farmland around Athens. For the Athenians, watching their fields burn while they crowded behind the city's long walls was a bitter pill. Yet Pericles insisted it was the only way. Athens must endure these raids and use its navy to choke Sparta's allies and bring the war to their enemies' shores. The Athenian fleet proved formidable. While Spartan hoplites cut down crops in Attica, Athenian ships raided the Peloponnesian coastline, striking with speed and vanishing back to sea. Athens' empire meant constant tribute, giving it resources that Sparta lacked. Yet this strategy came with terrible costs. The crowded conditions inside Athens' walls bred disease, and soon the great city faced not just Spartan attacks, but a deadly plague. In just a few years, Athens was devastated. The plague killed tens of thousands, including Pericles himself. Leadership passed into the hands of less cautious men, and the war grew bloodier, more chaotic, and harder to control. The Plague of Athens. As the Spartans returned year after year to burn Attica, Athens itself became a prison of fear and misery. Behind the long walls, tens of thousands of refugees from the countryside crowded into the already packed city. The air grew foul, supplies stretched thin, and tempers frayed. Then came the unthinkable. A mysterious plague swept through the city like wildfire. Thucydides, the historian who lived through it, described the suffering with chilling detail. Fevers that burned day and night, unquenchable thirst, bleeding sores, and the despair that broke even the strongest. No one was spared. Rich and poor alike perished in the streets. Temples filled with the dying, and funeral pyres burned day and night. Even doctors were struck down as they tried to treat the sick. In the chaos, laws and customs dissolved. People abandoned family members, robbed homes, and gave in to reckless indulgence, believing death would soon come for them anyway. The proud democracy of Athens was reduced to a city of desperation and despair. The plague claimed a staggering portion of Athens' population, perhaps a third of the entire city. Among the dead was Pericles, the cautious and steady leader whose vision had guided Athens for decades. His death left a dangerous vacuum. The men who came after him lacked his restraint. And as Athens struggled to recover, bold and reckless strategies began to take hold. For Sparta, the plague was a stroke of fortune. Their strategy had forced Athens into the crowded conditions that bred disease. Yet even Spartans could not exploit the disaster fully. They lacked the fleet to strike directly at the Athenian heart, and the war dragged on. The plague was not decisive in itself, but it crippled Athens at a critical moment and set the stage for a more chaotic and brutal phase of the war. The war was no longer a contest of cautious endurance. It became a struggle driven by desperation, bold gambles, and bitter hatred. With Pericles gone, the balance of wisdom and ambition that had once guided Athens was shattered forever. The rise of Cleon and the Warhawks. In the years after Pericles' death, new leaders rose to prominence, men who did not preach caution, but demanded action. Chief among them was Cleon, a fiery demagogue who gave powerful speeches to the Athenian assembly. Cleon argued that Athens should not simply defend itself, but crush its enemies, punish dissent, and show the strength of its empire. His words appealed to a population weary of suffering and eager for revenge. Cleon's policies marked a shift in Athenian conduct. Where Pericles had counseled patience, Cleon pushed for aggression. His most infamous act came after a revolt in Mytilene, one of Athens' subject states. When Mytilene tried to break away and join the Spartan side, Athens crushed the rebellion. In anger, Cleon proposed executing all the men of the city and enslaving the women and children, a brutal punishment meant to deter others. The assembly initially agreed, but overnight their conscience stirred, and the next day they reversed the decision, sparing most of the population. Still, the incident showed how war had hardened Athens and how Cleon's influence drove the city toward harsher measures. On the battlefield, Cleon's boldness sometimes paid off. He pushed for campaigns against Spartan allies and led successful expeditions that embarrassed Sparta. At Pylos in 425 BCE, Athens managed to trap a group of Spartan soldiers on the island of Spectaria. For the first time in memory, Spartan warriors surrendered rather than fight to the death. The shock reverberated across Greece. Sparta's legendary invincibility was broken, and Cleon basked in the glory of Athens' triumph. Yet Cleon was reckless as often as he was bold. His hawkish policies deepened the hatred between Athens and Sparta, making peace less likely. Where Pericles had sought to outlast Sparta, Cleon sought to destroy it, and in doing so he pushed Athens into ever riskier ventures. His rise revealed the darker side of democracy in wartime, the sway of passion, the lure of bold promises, and the peril of entrusting power to men who thrived on anger rather than prudence. For now, Athens enjoyed victories, and Sparta reeled from the humiliation at Spectaria, but history would show that fleeting triumphs often sowed the seeds of greater disasters. Brasidas and the northern campaigns. While Athens grew bold under Cleon, Sparta found an unlikely champion in Brasidas, one of its most daring generals. Unlike the rigid commanders of the past, Brasidas was imaginative, energetic, and charismatic. He believed that Sparta could not win the war by raiding Attica year after year. Instead, he struck at Athens' empire where it hurt most. In the north, where Athenian colonies and allies provided vital tribute and resources, Brasidas marched into Thrace, persuading cities to revolt against Athens with promises of freedom and Spartan support. His charm and rhetoric were unusual for a Spartan commander. He did not rely only on force, but on persuasion. His greatest triumph came when he convinced Amphipolis, a key Athenian colony on the Strymon River, to defect. Amphipolis controlled important timber and trade routes, and its loss was a devastating blow to Athens. Cleon could not let this stand. In 422 BCE, he led an expedition north to retake Amphipolis. The battle that followed proved decisive and tragic. Both Cleon and Brasidas were killed in the fighting. Their deaths removed two of the most influential figures driving the war forward. With the loss of these rival hawks, both Athens and Sparta suddenly found themselves more open to negotiation. The northern campaigns had shown that the war could not be contained. It spread far beyond Attica and the Peloponnesus, drawing in allies, colonies, and distant regions. What began as a conflict between two great powers was turning into a struggle for the entire Greek world. And yet, for a brief moment after Brasidas and Cleon fell, the path to peace seemed possible once again. The Peace of Nice. With both Cleon and Brasidas dead, Athens and Sparta were exhausted and ready to pause. In 421 BCE, a treaty known as the Peace of Nicias was signed, named after the cautious Athenian general who helped negotiate it. The agreement was meant to last 50 years, though most suspected it would not hold nearly that long. Each side promised to return captured territories and prisoners, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if Greece might step back from the brink of destruction. But beneath the surface, the peace was fragile. Many allies on both sides were dissatisfied. Corinth and other Peloponnesian states resented Sparta for agreeing to terms without consulting them fully. Some Athenian allies, too, felt betrayed, as not all territories were returned as promised. The war had sown bitterness that could not easily be washed away by treaties and handshakes. For Athens, the peace gave a chance to recover from years of plague, war, and loss. Its navy still dominated the seas, and its empire remained largely intact. Leaders like Nicias urged restraint, hoping to preserve Athens' strength through caution and diplomacy. Yet not all Athenians shared his view. There were others, ambitious, charismatic, and reckless, who saw the treaty not as an end, but as a temporary pause before even greater opportunities. Among them was a young man named Alcibiades. Brilliant, persuasive, and dangerously charming, Alcibiades would soon reshape the course of the war. Where Nicias sought stability, Alcibiades craved glory. His vision for Athens would lead the city not toward peace, but into one of the most ambitious and disastrous campaigns in its history. The peace of Nicias was, in truth, a fragile illusion. It calmed the battlefield for a time, but could not calm the restless ambitions of men who dreamed of empire and eternal fame. The rise of Alcibiades was one of the most controversial figures of the Peloponnesian War. A student of Socrates, he possessed both intelligence and charm, but also arrogance and boundless ambition. He dazzled the Athenian assembly with bold speeches and promises of victory, convincing many that Athens' destiny was to expand even further, beyond Greece itself. Where Nicias counseled caution, Alcibiades urged aggression. He believed Athens should not simply hold its empire, but expand it to dominate the Mediterranean. His vision centered on Sicily, a wealthy island filled with rival Greek colonies, fertile land, and strategic harbors. If Athens could conquer Sicily, Alcibiades argued, it would gain the resources to defeat Sparta once and for all, and perhaps even challenge Carthage, the great Western power. His words stirred the Athenian assembly. Many were weary of years of war, but the promise of wealth and glory was irresistible. Alcibiades painted the expedition as both achievable and necessary, a chance for Athens to prove its supremacy. His charisma won the day, and despite Nicias' desperate warnings, the assembly voted to send a massive fleet to Sicily. Alcibiades' rise marked a turning point for Athens. The city was no longer fighting a defensive war for survival, but was preparing to gamble everything on an audacious overseas conquest. It was a bold dream, and a reckless one. In Alcibiades, Athens found both its brightest flame and its most dangerous spark. He embodied the ambition of a city at its height, but his schemes would soon ignite a disaster from which Athens could never recover. The Sicilian expedition begins. In 415 BCE, the Athenians launched one of the largest expeditions in their history. Over 100 triremes, thousands of soldiers, and vast amounts of supplies set sail for Sicily. The fleet was a dazzling sight, a symbol of Athens' wealth, power, and confidence. Citizens gathered on the shore to watch, many believing this campaign would bring riches and secure their dominance for generations. Yet even before the fleet reached Sicily, troubles began. Alcibiades, the mastermind behind the plan, was accused of sacrilege, defacing religious statues in Athens just before the expedition. His enemies demanded he return home to stand trial. Fearing for his life, Alcibiades fled instead, eventually seeking refuge in Sparta, the very enemy he had urged Athens to destroy. The man who had inspired the expedition was now advising their foes. Left without Alcibiades, the command fell to Nicias and Lamachus. Nicias had opposed the expedition from the start and led reluctantly, while Lamachus was a capable but less influential figure. The divided leadership weakened Athens' resolve. Still, the fleet pressed on, landing in Sicily and beginning the long campaign against Syracuse, the island's most powerful city. At first, Athens enjoyed some successes, securing allies and establishing positions, but Syracuse was no easy target. Its defenses were strong, and with Alcibiades advising Sparta, the Syracusans soon gained reinforcements and new strategies. What Athens had hoped would be a swift victory was turning into a grinding and uncertain war, far from home. The Sicilian expedition was Athens' great gamble, a gamble that would test not only its military might but the very limits of its ambition. Disaster in Sicily? The Athenian campaign in Sicily soon spiraled into a nightmare. Nicias, ever cautious, hesitated at crucial moments, delaying assaults and allowing Syracuse time to fortify its defenses. Lamachus, the bolder commander, was killed in battle early on, leaving Nicias with sole command, a role he never wanted. His indecision proved fatal. Syracuse, meanwhile, received aid from the Peloponnesians, with Alcibiades whispering in Spartan ears. A Spartan general named Gylippus sailed to Sicily with reinforcements. His arrival transformed the conflict. Gylippus was a man of action, rallying the Syracusans and leading daring counterattacks that shocked the Athenians. the balance of power shifted, and the once confident Athenian army found itself trapped in a brutal war of attrition. Nicias, already ill and exhausted, sent desperate messages back to Athens, begging for reinforcements. The Athenians, unwilling to admit defeat, responded by sending an even larger fleet under the command of Demosthenes. But by the time Demosthenes arrived, the situation was grim. Disease spread through the Athenian camp, morale collapsed, and Syracusan resistance stiffened with every passing day. In a final attempt, Demosthenes launched a bold night attack on the Syracusan defenses. Chaos ensued in the darkness. Soldiers became disoriented, formations broke apart, and panic spread. The Athenians were repelled with heavy losses, their spirits shattered. Demosthenes urged withdrawal, but Nicias hesitated yet again, unwilling to abandon the campaign that had cost so much. When they finally attempted to retreat, the Syracusans struck mercilessly. The Athenian fleet was cornered and annihilated in the harbor. Survivors fled inland, only to be hunted down and captured. Nicias and Demosthenes were executed, and thousands of Athenian soldiers were thrown into the quarries of Syracuse, left to die slowly under the sun. The Sicilian expedition ended not in triumph, but in total ruin. The aftermath of Sicily. The disaster in Sicily shook Athens to its core. The loss of so many ships, soldiers, and resources was a blow from which the city would never fully recover. What had begun as a gamble for glory turned into a catastrophe that emboldened Sparta and horrified Athens' allies. The once invincible Athenian empire suddenly looked vulnerable. News of the defeat spread quickly across Greece. Cities that had long been forced into Athens' empire saw the opportunity to revolt. Tribute payments dried up, rebellions erupted, and trust in Athenian leadership collapsed. For the first time in decades, Sparta had the upper hand. Inside Athens, the political climate turned poisonous. The blame game began, with factions tearing into one another. Some blamed Nicias' hesitations, others the reckless ambition of Alcibiades, who had betrayed the city. Ordinary citizens, weary of war, despaired at the endless sacrifices demanded of them. The democratic system that had carried Athens through its golden age was fracturing under the weight of defeat. Sparta seized the moment. With Persian gold now flowing into their coffers, the Spartans built a fleet capable of challenging Athenian naval supremacy. For years, Athens had ruled the sea with little competition, but that era was ending. The Peloponnesian War was entering a new, more desperate phase, one that would drag the entire Greek world deeper into chaos. The Sicilian disaster was more than a military defeat. It was the beginning of the end for Athens. Persia enters the war. One of the most remarkable turns in the later stages of the Peloponnesian War was the involvement of Persia. Once the common enemy of all Greeks, Persia now saw an opportunity to exploit Greek weakness for its own benefit. The empire's satraps in Asia Minor began funneling money to Sparta, providing the resources to build and maintain a fleet. For Sparta, this was a game-changer. Traditionally a land power, they had always struggled to challenge Athens at sea. But with Persian funding, they constructed a formidable navy and hired skilled sailors from across the Aegean. Under the leadership of capable admirals like Lysander, Sparta was suddenly a threat on both land and water. Athens, meanwhile, found itself stretched thin. Its treasury was nearly empty after the Sicilian catastrophe, and its allies were rebelling. To pay for warships, the city resorted to increasingly harsh measures, seizing wealth and squeezing tribute from allies. Resentment grew, and what had once been a proud empire began to look more like an oppressive overlord clinging to power. The Persian alliance also destabilized the Greek political scene. Some Athenians, seeing the city's dire position, began pushing for oligarchic reforms, arguing that democracy had led them into ruin. Coups and revolts rocked Athens itself, as internal divisions deepened at the very moment when unity was most needed. The entry of Persia turned the Peloponnesian War from a Greek conflict into something larger, a struggle in which outside empires played Greeks against each other to weaken them all. Alcibiades returned. In one of the most dramatic twists of the war, Alcibiades re-entered the Athenian story. After betraying Athens and aiding Sparta, he fell out of favor with the Spartans as well. His restless ambition and scandals made him too dangerous even for them. Seeking refuge once again, Alcibiades turned back toward Athens, offering his services in exchange for forgiveness. Remarkably, Athens agreed. Desperate for capable leadership after the Sicilian disaster, the Athenians reinstated him. With his trademark charisma, Alcibiades convinced the assembly that he alone could restore their fortunes. For a time, it seemed he was right. Under his command, Athens won a series of naval victories, regaining some of its confidence and reversing Spartan gains. Alcibiades also played the role of diplomat, skillfully managing alliances and rallying Athenian supporters abroad. His return injected new energy into the war effort, and many began to believe that Athens might yet recover. But Alcibiades was always a figure of controversy. His enemies remained numerous, and his flamboyant style constantly drew suspicion. Though his victories bought Athens precious time, the city's underlying weaknesses, financial ruin, internal division, and exhausted manpower, could not be solved by charisma alone. Alcibiades' return was a brief spark in the darkness. but the storm that would engulf Athens was still gathering, the final phase of the war. As the war dragged into its third decade, Greece was exhausted. Entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Fields lay fallow, trade had dwindled, and entire cities had been ravaged by siege and revolt. Yet neither Athens nor Sparta would relent. Sparta, strengthened by Persian support, began to dominate at sea. Their admiral Lysander proved a cunning and ruthless strategist, one who understood not only how to fight battles but how to break Athens' will. By targeting Athenian supply lines and harassing its allies, Lysander steadily strangled the empire. Athens fought desperately, but its fleet was stretched thin, its treasury empty, and its people weary. Still, the Athenians refused to surrender. Their spirit of defiance, the same spirit that had carried them against Persia decades earlier, kept them in the fight long after the odds had turned. The war reached its climax at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BCE, in a decisive strike. Lysander's fleet caught the Athenians off guard, destroying almost their entire navy in a single day. Without ships, Athens could no longer import grain from the Black Sea, leaving the city to starve. Sparta moved in for the final blow. By 404 BCE, Athens, once the proud leader of Greece, was forced to surrender. The walls of the city were torn down, its empire dissolved, and its navy reduced to a handful of ships. The Peloponnesian War was over, and Sparta had emerged as the new master of Greece. The fall of Athens. The surrender of Athens in 404 BCE was more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of an entire way of life. For nearly a century, Athens had stood at the center of Greek culture, a beacon of democracy, philosophy, art, and naval power. Now, its long walls were torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes, a humiliating symbol of conquest. The Athenians, who once dictated terms to others, now bent under the rule of their rivals. Sparta installed a puppet regime in the city, known as the 30 Tyrants. This oligarchic council, backed by Spartan arms, quickly unleashed a reign of terror. Political opponents were executed, property was confiscated, and exile became common. Many Athenians who had fought so hard for their democracy now watched in horror as it was dismantled piece by piece. The 30 ruled with cruelty, and though their reign lasted less than a year, it scarred the city deeply. But even in defeat, Athens refused to vanish. Resistance against the 30 grew, led by democratic exiles who rallied outside the city and returned with force. In a dramatic reversal, the Athenians overthrew the tyrants and restored democracy. Though weakened and humbled, the city reclaimed its institutions, determined not to let the dream of self-rule be extinguished. The restoration was a bittersweet victory. Athens survived, but it would never again dominate Greece as it once had. Its empire was gone, its wealth depleted, and its people permanently divided by decades of war. Yet in its stubborn refusal to die, Athens proved that its spirit was not entirely broken. Sparta's hollow victory. Sparta emerged from the Peloponnesian War as the undisputed master of Greece, but their triumph was less secure than it appeared. The Spartan system, built around a rigid military elite ruling over a vast population of helots, was never designed to sustain a long-term empire. With victory came responsibility, and the Spartans soon found themselves struggling to manage the world they had conquered. Sparta's harsh rule alienated its allies almost immediately. Many Greek cities had fought alongside Sparta to throw off Athenian dominance, only to find themselves subject to Spartan garrisons and Spartan governors. What had once been a war of liberation now looked like a mere exchange of masters. Resentment brewed, and rebellions began to simmer. Meanwhile, Sparta's alliance with Persia had costs. In exchange for Persian gold, the Spartans had effectively abandoned the Ionian Greeks in Asia Minor, leaving them under Persian control. For a people who had once claimed to fight for Hellenic freedom, this betrayal tarnished Sparta's reputation. Inside Sparta itself, victory brought decay. Wealth and foreign influence began to corrode the simple, disciplined lifestyle that had defined the Spartans. Luxury seeped in, undermining the very values that had once made them strong. Within a generation, the mighty Spartan Empire was already fraying at the edges. The Peloponnesian War had broken Athens, but it left Sparta burdened with a crown it was never meant to wear. The shifting balance of power. The decades after the Peloponnesian War were marked by constant upheaval. With Athens weakened, and Sparta struggling to maintain its supremacy, a new balance of power emerged. Other Greek states, Thebes, Corinth, and eventually even a resurgent Athens, seized their chance to assert themselves. Wars flared repeatedly as alliances shifted. Former enemies became allies, and old allies turned against one another. Thebes, once a minor power overshadowed by its neighbors, rose to prominence, challenging Sparta directly. In 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, the Theban general Epaminondas shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility, destroying the Spartan army and permanently ending their dominance. Athens too experienced a partial recovery. Though it never regained its empire in full, the city remained a cultural and intellectual powerhouse. Its philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and their successors, continued to shape Western thought, even as its political influence waned. In many ways, Athens' greatest contributions came not from its empire but from its resilience and creativity in the aftermath of defeat. The Peloponnesian War had not crowned a lasting victor. Instead, it left Greece fractured, exhausted, and vulnerable. That vulnerability would soon be exploited by an outsider waiting on the horizon, the Macedonian shadow. As the Greek city-states bled themselves dry in endless wars, a new power quietly gathered strength in the north, Macedonia. Long dismissed as a backward kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, Macedonia underwent a transformation under the leadership of Philip II. Philip was a master strategist and reformer. He reorganized the Macedonian army into a formidable machine, introducing the phalanx with long sarissas that could break traditional hoplite formations. He also used diplomacy, bribery, and marriage alliances to expand his influence, steadily encroaching on the affairs of southern Greece. The weakened state of the Greek cities made his task easier. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, once giants, were now shadows of their former selves. Their rivalries prevented unity, even when the Macedonian threat became clear. By the time they realized the danger, it was too late. In 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Greece was no longer master of itself. The era of independent city-states had ended, replaced by the dominance of Macedonia, and soon, under Philip's son Alexander, the conquest of the known world. The Peloponnesian War had weakened Greece to the point where it could no longer resist the rise of outsiders. In many ways, the seeds of Alexander's empire were planted in the ashes of Athens and Sparta. The human cost of war. While battles and treaties often dominate historical accounts, the Peloponnesian War left a deeper wound on the everyday lives of Greeks. Decades of conflict meant generations grew up knowing little but war. Farmers lost their land as armies trampled fields, burned crops, and occupied villages. Refugees crowded into cities like Athens, creating shortages, disease, and constant anxiety. For many, the war meant not the clash of generals, but the slow grind of starvation and uncertainty. The plague of Athens underscored just how fragile life had become. With the city overcrowded behind its long walls, disease spread rapidly, killing thousands, including Pericles himself. The suffering was relentless, and survivors carried both physical scars and deep emotional trauma. Some turned cynical, losing faith in gods or leaders who seemed powerless to protect them. Others became hardened, embracing cruelty as a means of survival in a brutal age. For women, the war was especially disruptive. With men away fighting or killed in battle, women often managed households alone, bearing the burden of survival. Some were thrust into roles of economic importance, while others endured the hardships of widowhood and the loss of sons. In captured cities, women and children frequently became the spoils of war, sold into slavery or forced into exile. Slaves themselves were deeply affected, for armies often promised freedom to those who would defect or fight for them. Thousands took the chance, escaping their masters to join one side or the other. These shifts in population destabilized the delicate social fabric of Greece. The war was not just a clash of hoplites and navies, it was a grinding catastrophe that reshaped the lives of countless ordinary people. Its human toll is perhaps the most enduring reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition. Thucydides and the birth of critical history. The Peloponnesian War also gave the world one of its greatest historians. Thucydides, an Athenian general turned exile. Thucydides witnessed the conflict firsthand and dedicated his life to chronicling it. His work, The History of the Peloponnesian War, remains unmatched in its depth, rigor, and insight. Unlike earlier historians who often blended myth and fact, Thucydides sought to strip away legend and divine influence, focusing instead on human motives, fear, honor, and interest. He argued that wars are not merely accidents of fate, but the products of political ambition and human nature. This analytical approach was revolutionary, laying the foundations for modern historical writing. Thucydides' speeches, often placed into the mouths of leaders like Pericles or the Spartan envoys, captured the essence of political rhetoric. The famous funeral oration of Pericles became a timeless meditation on democracy, sacrifice, and civic duty. Conversely, the Melian dialogue revealed the brutal logic of power, with Athens coldly telling the neutral Melians that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. His work was left unfinished at his death, cutting off abruptly mid-sentence, yet even in its incomplete form, it shaped centuries of thought, influencing statesmen, philosophers, and generals alike. From Machiavelli to modern political science, echoes of Thucydides can be found wherever power and strategy are studied. Through him, the Peloponnesian War became more than an ancient conflict. It became a mirror reflecting the timeless struggles of humanity: ambition, pride, fear, and the fragile balance between freedom and power. Cultural shifts in a war-torn Greece. The Peloponnesian War not only destroyed armies, but also reshaped culture. Athens, though politically weakened, remained the artistic and intellectual heart of Greece. Its tragedies, comedies, and philosophical schools flourished even as the city staggered from war to war. In some ways, hardships seemed to fuel creativity. Playwrights like Euripides captured the despair and moral ambiguity of the age. His plays often challenged traditional values, questioning the gods, the justice of war, and the role of women. In works like The Trojan Women, audiences saw reflections of their own suffering, as conquered women lamented the destruction of their cities. His art gave voice to the pain of war in ways speeches never could. Comedy, too, became sharper. Aristophanes mocked the war mercilessly, ridiculing politicians, generals, and even the gods for allowing such madness to continue. Through satire, he gave the Athenian people a chance to laugh at their misery, and to criticize those in power without open revolt. His plays remind us that even in times of despair, humor could be a form of resistance. Philosophy also thrived. Socrates, wandering the streets of Athens, challenged citizens to question their assumptions and confront uncomfortable truths. His relentless questioning unsettled many, but planted seeds that would grow into the great philosophical traditions of Plato and Aristotle. The war created an environment in which people sought deeper answers about justice, power, and the purpose of life. Even in defeat, Athens remained a cultural giant, proving that creativity can endure, and even sharpen in the face of destruction. Sparta's hollow victory. When Sparta finally emerged victorious in 404 BCE, many expected it to usher in an era of stability. Instead, victory revealed cracks in Sparta's system. The rigid discipline that had allowed Spartans to dominate in battle was ill-suited to managing an empire. They had defeated Athens, but governing an entire Greek world was something different altogether. Sparta installed oligarchic regimes, known as the 30 Tyrants in Athens and similar councils elsewhere. These puppet governments quickly became infamous for their brutality, seizing property and executing opponents. Rather than cement Spartan rule, these regimes bred resentment and rebellion, undermining the very authority they were meant to secure. Economically, Sparta's society remained fragile. With so few full Spartan citizens and such heavy reliance on helot labor, it could not sustain prolonged overseas commitments. Campaigns drained resources, and maintaining dominance over rest of allies proved exhausting. Unlike Athens, Sparta lacked a strong navy and vibrant trade, making its position precarious. Politically, Sparta's leadership was divided. Kings, FOS, and generals often quarreled about policy. Some wanted to continue projecting Spartan power abroad, while others sought to retreat inward, preserving the old ways. These tensions left the victors unsure of how to wield their newfound supremacy. In the end, Sparta's victory was less the dawn of a golden age than the start of decline. The Peloponnesian War had elevated Sparta to the height of Greek power, but it also revealed that the city-state was better suited to fighting than to ruling. Its dominance would prove short-lived. The rise of Thebes. In the shadow of the Peloponnesian War, another city-state began to rise. Thebes. Long overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, Thebes had often been dismissed as a second-rate power. But in the decades after the war, Thebes would challenge both former titans and briefly dominate the Greek stage. Thebes first gained attention when it broke free from Spartan control. Discontent simmered under Spartan garrisons, and daring Theban leaders orchestrated assassinations and uprisings to reclaim independence. Their boldness paid off, and soon Thebes became a rallying point for those disillusioned with Spartan hegemony. Military innovation played a key role in their ascent. The Theban general Epaminondas introduced new tactics, such as the oblique phalanx, which concentrated force at a decisive point rather than spreading it evenly. This approach allowed Theban armies to punch through enemy lines, overturning centuries of hoplite tradition. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. There, Theban forces shattered Sparta's legendary hoplites, killing hundreds of its citizen soldiers for the first time in history. Sparta's aura of invincibility collapsed. Greek eyes turned to Thebes, now the leading military power. Yet like Athens and Sparta before them, Thebes discovered the burden of leadership. Its dominance lasted only a few decades before new forces shifted the balance once more. But for a brief moment, Thebes reminded the Greek world that power was never static, and even underdogs could rise to the summit. The shifting balance of Greek power, the Peloponnesian War had permanently destabilized the Greek world. Athens was weakened, Sparta overextended, and Thebes a temporary champion. No single city-state could maintain dominance for long, and this constant jockeying for supremacy created a power vacuum. In this fractured environment, alliances shifted rapidly. Former enemies became allies, only to betray one another a few years later. Wars flared up almost continuously, draining resources and leaving the Greek world vulnerable. The dream of a united Greece faded, replaced by endless rivalry. Economically, the constant warfare devastated trade routes and agricultural production. Cities struggled to rebuild, and many younger men had grown up knowing only conflict, limiting labor and innovation. Where Athens had once led the Mediterranean in commerce, now instability disrupted its networks. Culturally, however, Greek creativity endured. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle thrived in this chaotic age, asking questions about politics, ethics, and human purpose that reflected the instability around them. Their ideas laid the foundations for Western thought, even as their cities struggled with turmoil. This period of flux was crucial, for it set the stage for something new, the rise of a power outside the traditional Greek heartland. While Athens, Sparta, and Thebes fought among themselves, a kingdom to the north was quietly preparing to change history forever. The human cost of the war, beyond strategies, generals, and battles. The Peloponnesian War was a deeply human tragedy. Ordinary farmers, sailors, and craftsmen bore the brunt of the conflict. Entire generations of young men were cut down in their prime, leaving behind widows, fatherless children, and villages emptied of workers. Athenian cemeteries filled with nameless graves, while Spartan women who had been proud to say their sons were warriors now mourned the collapse of families. The psychological scars were equally deep. For decades, Greek society had been bound together by shared festivals, athletic contests, and religious pilgrimages. The war fractured these traditions, as suspicion spread between allies and enemies alike. Trust eroded, not just between cities, but within them, as civil wars broke out in places like Corcyra, pitting neighbors against each other in cycles of betrayal and revenge. Plague, famine, and displacement added to the suffering. Refugees crowded into Athens when Spartan armies ravaged the countryside, creating unsanitary conditions that fueled epidemics. Families accustomed to the rhythms of farming now lived in squalid urban quarters, their rural lives lost forever. For many, survival became the only goal, eclipsing civic pride or artistic flourishing. And yet, resilience persisted. Even in wartime, plays were performed in Athens, temples were built or repaired, and philosophers continued to teach. The war revealed both the fragility and the endurance of human societies, how easily life could unravel, and yet how stubbornly people clung to culture and meaning. Ultimately, the human toll of the Peloponnesian War reminds us that behind every account of strategy and conquest lies the reality of ordinary lives disrupted. These were the men and women who carried the war's burden, long after generals had claimed their victories or written their histories. Thucydides and the Search for Truth. No account of the Peloponnesian War would be complete without Thucydides, the Athenian general turned historian, whose chronicle remains one of the greatest works of historical writing ever produced. Unlike Herodotus, who mixed myth and history, Thucydides aimed to present an unflinching, rational analysis of human behavior in war. Exiled after a military failure, he had the distance to observe events with critical eyes. His account delved into speeches, motives, and the raw calculations of power. For him, history was not about pleasing stories, but about timeless lessons. He famously declared that his work was a possession for all time, meant to help future generations understand the recurring patterns of human conflict. His writing was unsparing. He described the brutality of civil wars, the cruelty of empire, and the selfishness of leaders with precision. The Melian dialogue, in which Athenian envoys justify conquest with the chilling phrase, "The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must," captures the stark realism that defined his perspective. At the same time, Thucydides acknowledged the limits of his knowledge. He admitted when he could not know what had been said, reconstructing speeches to capture the essence rather than the exact words. This honesty about uncertainty made his history more credible, not less, and laid the groundwork for modern historical inquiry. Thucydides' legacy outlived Athens, Sparta, and even Greece. Statesmen, generals, and thinkers from Rome to the present day have read him, finding in his pages the brutal truths of ambition, fear, and human frailty. His voice continues to echo, making the Peloponnesian War not merely an ancient conflict, but a mirror held up to every age. A world shaken, not settled. The end of the Peloponnesian War left Greece in a state of exhaustion. Though Sparta emerged as the nominal victor, the world it inherited was not one of stability but of ruin. Cities had been burned, treasuries drained, and generations of young men lost in ceaseless campaigns. Athens, once the shining beacon of democracy and empire, had seen its walls torn down and its fleet surrendered, yet its spirit had not been entirely broken. The ashes of war still smoldered, and within them lay both resentment and the seeds of future turmoil. For the ordinary Greek, life after the war was grim. Farmers returned to find their fields ravaged by repeated invasions, their vineyards uprooted, and their livestock stolen. Merchants who once thrived under Athenian naval dominance now faced piracy and chaos along trade routes. Even Sparta's allies, who had fought with the hope of liberation from Athenian rule, soon realized that their new Spartan overlords were less liberators and more exploiters. Disillusionment spread quickly. Sparta's reputation as the champion of freedom rapidly crumbled. Its system of imposing oligarchies in conquered cities, known as the dikarchies, was deeply unpopular. Spartan governors and garrisons often acted with arrogance and brutality, enriching themselves at the expense of the very allies they had sworn to protect. Resentment towards Spartan hegemony grew, and whispers of rebellion began almost as soon as the war ended. Yet even in this fractured landscape, culture continued to flourish. Athens, though politically humbled, remained a center of philosophy, drama, and art. The ideas of Socrates gained traction, sparking debates about justice, virtue, and the meaning of power. The war had broken cities, but it had not silenced thought. Indeed, for many intellectuals, the devastation made the need to question the old ways all the more urgent. In this uneasy peace, Greece found itself both free from war and yet trapped in its consequences. Victory had brought no unity, only shifting rivalries. The Peloponnesian War had not resolved the Greek question of dominance. It had merely reshaped it. What followed was less a peace and more an interlude. A pause before new conflicts erupted, Spartan supremacy and its cracks. Sparta stood at the height of its power in the immediate aftermath of the war. Its warriors had humbled the mighty Athenian fleet, its kings dictated terms, and its allies looked to it as the arbiter of Greece. For the first time in history, the Spartan system built on discipline, simplicity, and military strength had a chance to govern a wider world. Yet the very qualities that made Sparta victorious on the battlefield proved ill-suited for ruling a sprawling empire. The Spartans had little experience with diplomacy or administration. Their society was designed for war, not governance. Unlike Athens, which had developed bureaucracies and legal institutions to manage its empire, Sparta relied on sending out harmosts, military governors, and enforcing loyalty through garrisons. This heavy-handed approach alienated former allies who had hoped for autonomy after breaking free from Athenian control. Instead, they found themselves trading one master for another. Economically, Sparta was ill-prepared for leadership. Its strength had always been in land power, not commerce. Now it was expected to control the seas and regulate trade, a realm where Athens had long excelled. Spartan fleets hastily built with Persian gold during the final years of the war quickly deteriorated without sustained investment. The Spartans' disdain for money and business meant they lacked the tools to sustain their supremacy in an increasingly interconnected Greek world. Internally, cracks appeared as well. The rigid Spartan system depended on a delicate balance between the ruling Thucydides, the free but non-citizen Perioko, and the vast enslaved population of Helots. The war had strained this balance. Many Spartiates had died in battle, reducing their numbers to a dangerous low. The Helots, emboldened by years of disruption, grew restless. For Sparta, the greatest danger was not always external enemies, but the simmering unrest within its own borders. Though Sparta had won the war, its supremacy carried the seeds of its decline. The city that had built its reputation on discipline and restraint now faced temptations of power and wealth it was not equipped to handle. Victory, instead of cementing Spartan dominance, set it on a path of overextension and internal decay. The Persian shadow. One of the most striking features of the Peloponnesian War was the role of Persia. Once the great enemy of Greece during the Persian Wars, the Persian Empire re-emerged as a decisive player in Greek affairs. By funding Sparta's fleet in the later stages of the conflict, Persia had ensured Athens' downfall. Yet Persia's motives were never about Greek unity. They were about restoring control over the Ionian cities and keeping the fractious Greeks divided. With Athens defeated, Persia moved quickly to reassert influence along the Aegean coast. Spartan leaders, initially celebrated as liberators, found themselves negotiating with Persian satraps who demanded concessions. The uneasy alliance between Sparta and Persia was based less on friendship and more on necessity. Sparta needed Persian gold to maintain its fleets. Persia needed Sparta to suppress Athenian resurgence. But mistrust lingered on both sides. For the Greek world, Persia's involvement was a bitter irony. The same cities that had once united at Marathon and Salamis to repel Persian invaders were now willingly entangled in Persian politics. Some Greeks viewed this as a betrayal of their ancestors' sacrifices, a sign that the ideals of freedom and independence had been corroded by ambition and necessity. Persian influence also deepened the divisions within Greece. Some cities favored closer ties with Persia for the stability and resources it offered, while others resisted, fearing the loss of autonomy. This dynamic created a web of shifting allegiances that would dominate Greek politics in the decades after the war. In the end, Persia proved to be one of the true winners of the Peloponnesian conflict. Without fighting on Greek soil, it regained sway over Ionia and ensured that the Greek world remained too divided to threaten its empire again. For Greece, the specter of Persian influence was a constant reminder that their own rivalries had made them vulnerable to outside control. Athens in defeat, Athens in resilience. The surrender of Athens in 404 BCE marked the lowest point in the city's history. Its once proud fleet had been destroyed, its empire dismantled, and its walls torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes. Yet even in defeat, Athens retained something that Sparta could not so easily destroy: its cultural and intellectual vitality. While its political power had collapsed, its influence as a center of ideas, drama, and philosophy continued almost undiminished. The Spartans imposed a harsh regime known as the 30 Tyrants, a pro-Spartan oligarchy that ruled Athens with cruelty. Hundreds of citizens were executed or exiled, property was confiscated, and fear reigned in the streets. But this regime lasted less than a year before Athenians, led by democratic exiles, rose up and restored their democracy. It was a testament to the resilience of Athens that, even after catastrophic defeat, its people refused to let the idea of democracy die. In the years that followed, Athens rebuilt itself in surprising ways. It no longer had an empire, but it became once more a hub of learning and creativity. Philosophers like Socrates questioned the moral foundations of power and justice. Playwrights like Aristophanes used comedy to lampoon politics and war. The very experience of loss gave Athenian thinkers new urgency, asking whether ambition, greed, or pride had doomed their city. For ordinary Athenians, life was still hard. Trade had declined, and many families lived in poverty, yet the communal life of the polis endured. Festivals, debates, and theater continued, offering moments of shared identity. In this way, Athens survived not as a great empire, but as a living community that preserved and spread ideas that would echo for centuries. Defeated on the battlefield, Athens emerged as a cultural victor, while Sparta struggled to manage its fragile supremacy. Athens kept alive the flame of philosophy, democracy, and art, a flame that would outlast the victors of the Peloponnesian War. The rise of Thebes. While Athens rebuilt and Sparta overextended, another city began to rise, Thebes. Long overshadowed by its more famous neighbors, Thebes took advantage of the post-war instability to assert itself as a power in central Greece. Known for its strong cavalry and fierce hoplites, Thebes had often played a secondary role in Greek politics, but now it sought a leading role in reshaping the balance of power. Initially, Thebes had been an ally of Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, helping in the destruction of Athens, yet it quickly grew disillusioned with Spartan dominance. Spartan garrisons, stationed across Greece, including in Thebes, became symbols of oppression. Thebes, like many other cities, soon realized that Sparta's promise of liberation had been hollow. Over time, Theban leaders cultivated both military strength and political influence. Their ambitions were sharpened by resentment against Spartan arrogance. This growing hostility would eventually lead to open conflict, culminating in one of the most dramatic shifts in Greek history, the Theban defeat of Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. But even before that moment, Thebes' steady rise showed how unstable Spartan supremacy truly was. For Thebans, the post-war years were about opportunity. While Athens licked its wounds and Sparta stretched itself thin, Thebes positioned itself as a contender for leadership. Its warriors trained, its alliances expanded, and its leaders prepared for the moment when history would open the door to their ascendancy. The rise of Thebes illustrated the fundamental truth of the Greek world. No single city could dominate forever. Power shifted like the tides, and every victor eventually faced its own reckoning. The legacy of the war on democracy, the Peloponnesian War, was not just a clash of armies, but a trial of political systems. Athens had championed democracy, flawed, volatile, yet revolutionary in its inclusiveness. Sparta had upheld oligarchy, a narrow rule of the few, justified by tradition and military discipline. The war tested both systems under fire, and its aftermath revealed how deeply politics had been scarred. Athens' democracy proved remarkably resilient. Though temporarily crushed by the 30 tyrants, it returned stronger and, in some ways, wiser. Citizens had experienced tyranny firsthand, and their renewed democracy carried a sharper awareness of the dangers of concentrating power in too few hands. The Athenian experiment had survived its gravest challenge. Elsewhere in Greece, however, democracy did not fare so well. Many cities, influenced by Sparta or internal strife, fell into cycles of oligarchy, tyranny, or civil war. The war had shown how fragile Greek political systems were when subjected to foreign pressure and internal division. Yet the legacy of Athenian democracy endured because of its ideals. Philosophers and historians recorded debates about freedom, equality, and justice. Even critics like Plato, who distrusted democracy, could not ignore its central role in Greek life. The Peloponnesian War had nearly extinguished it. But in the embers of Athens' resilience, democracy's influence spread into future generations. Thus, the political legacy of the war was paradoxical. It weakened democracy in practice, but strengthened it as an idea. The vision of citizens ruling themselves remained one of Athens' greatest gifts to history, even in the shadow of defeat. The rise of mercenaries. One of the most lasting consequences of the Peloponnesian War was the rise of mercenary armies. Before the conflict, citizen soldiers, farmers, and craftsmen who took up their shields when called had formed the backbone of Greek warfare. But decades of near-constant fighting changed this tradition. Men who lost their farms or livelihoods often turned to war as a profession. Their skills, honed on endless battlefields, became a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Both Athens and Sparta had relied on mercenaries at different points during the war, especially for naval service or in distant campaigns. After the war, however, mercenaries became central to Greek conflict. Leaders who wanted power no longer needed the support of their entire citizenry. They could simply hire soldiers. This shift weakened the connection between the polis and warfare, undermining the old ideal that citizens fought to defend their community. Mercenaries also spread instability. Disbanded armies often roamed the countryside, raiding and pillaging when they could not find employers. Entire bands of seasoned fighters, armed and desperate, became a dangerous presence in the post-war world. For rulers, they were both a tool and a threat, useful in seizing power, but difficult to control once unleashed. The famous 10,000, a Greek mercenary army hired by Cyrus the Younger to seize the Persian throne, embodied this trend. Though their employer failed, their epic retreat through hostile lands demonstrated both the dangers and the resilience of these new professional soldiers. Their journey would later inspire leaders like Alexander the Great. The rise of mercenaries marked a transformation of Greek warfare. No longer tied exclusively to the citizen ideal, war had become a trade, one that flourished in the ruins left by the Peloponnesian War. Sparta's hollow supremacy. When the war ended, Sparta appeared the undisputed master of Greece. Its hoplites had triumphed, its fleet dominated the seas, and its allies obeyed out of fear. Yet beneath the surface, Spartan power was fragile. Victory had overextended the Spartan system, pushing it into roles it was never designed to sustain. Sparta's society was built for discipline and simplicity, not empire. Its rigid social structure, which relied on a small class of full citizens ruling over a vast population of helots, was stable only when focused on defense. Running an empire, however, demanded diplomacy, wealth, and flexibility, qualities Sparta lacked. The city had few resources to manage distant garrisons and relied heavily on Persian gold to maintain its fleet. Moreover, Sparta's supremacy bred resentment. Allies who had once joined the war to free themselves from Athenian domination soon realized that Spartan rule was even harsher. Garrisons occupied cities, oligarchies were imposed, and opposition was crushed. Far from liberators, the Spartans became seen as oppressors. At home, Sparta's small citizen population could not sustain endless campaigns. The cost of war drained its manpower, while luxury and corruption, once despised, began creeping into Spartan life. The rigid ideals of Lycurgus eroded as wealth from empire flowed in. Sparta, for all its glory, was hollowing out from within. Thus, the very war that brought Sparta to the height of its power also sowed the seeds of its decline. The city of hoplites and iron discipline was ill-suited to wear the crown of Greece. Athens turns to philosophy. Defeated on the battlefield, Athens found consolation in thought. The decades after the Peloponnesian War became a golden age, not of empire, but of philosophy. Men who had seen the futility of politics and war turned inward, asking questions about virtue, justice, and the nature of human life. Foremost among these was Socrates, whose probing questions unsettled his fellow Athenians. To a city humbled by war, his insistence that people examine their lives was both inspiring and troubling. He challenged complacency, mocked false wisdom, and refused to flatter those in power. In a society still recovering from trauma, his voice was both a beacon and a provocation. Plato, his student, transformed these dialogues into a vision of ideal society. Having seen Athens' democracy falter, Plato sought a political order rooted in philosophy rather than passion. His Republic asked whether justice could ever truly prevail in human affairs. For him, the lesson of the war was clear. Without wisdom, no system, not democracy, not oligarchy, could endure. Meanwhile, others like Xenophon reflected on the practical lessons of leadership in war, preserving stories of both Socratic wisdom and military campaigns. Together, these thinkers turned Athens into a new kind of empire, one of the mind. Thus, while Sparta held the spear, Athens claimed something more enduring, the pen and the question. The philosophical ferment born from defeat would echo long after the hoplite phalanx had faded. The Persian shadow. Throughout the Peloponnesian War, Persia had played the role of financier and manipulator, backing first one side, then the other, to weaken Greece. When the war ended, the Persian Empire remained the ultimate power in the eastern Mediterranean, its wealth dwarfing that of any single Greek polis. Persia's strategy had been brilliantly simple. Let the Greeks exhaust themselves. By providing gold for Spartan fleets, Persia ensured Athens' defeat without risking its own forces. Once the war was over, Persia swiftly reasserted control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor, proving that the sacrifices of decades of fighting had changed little for those communities. For the Greeks, this was a bitter truth. They had torn each other apart, only to see the old enemy grow stronger. Persian satraps continued to meddle in Greek politics, funding rebellions and shifting alliances to keep the cities divided. The war had not freed Greece, but left it vulnerable. And yet, Persia also became a stage for Greek ambition. Mercenaries sought employment there, philosophers traveled to its courts, and traders reaped profits from its markets. The empire was both a threat and a lure, a shadow that loomed over every decision in post-war Greece. In the end, the Peloponnesian War had not resolved the balance between Greece and Persia. Instead, it had deepened Greek dependence on Persian gold, a dependence that would last until a new power rose to challenge the great king on his own soil. Civil strife and the shattered polis. One of the most corrosive legacies of the war was the outbreak of civil strife within the Greek cities themselves. Known as stasis, these conflicts tore communities apart, pitting factions of democrats and oligarchs against one another. The war had amplified ideological divisions, and once unleashed, they were difficult to contain. In Corcyra, Thucydides recorded one of the most harrowing episodes. Citizens slaughtered neighbors. Families betrayed one another, and language itself was twisted, with cruelty called justice and treachery called loyalty. What happened there was not unique. It was a mirror of the moral collapse spreading across the Greek world. The Peloponnesian War gave factions excuses to seek foreign allies. Oligarchs turned to Sparta, democrats to Athens, inviting outside powers into local disputes. Cities became pawns in the greater struggle, but the cost was always borne by ordinary people. Executions, exiles, and confiscations became common, leaving wounds that lasted long after the war. Even after peace returned, the memory of civil war haunted Greece. Distrust lingered, and the unity of the polis, the foundation of Greek identity, was permanently weakened. A society once defined by community had been fractured by decades of suspicion and betrayal. The Peloponnesian War was thus not only a conflict between Athens and Sparta, but also a war within Greece itself. Its deepest scars were not in the fields of battle, but in the broken bonds of the polis. Economic ruin and recovery. The economic toll of the Peloponnesian War cannot be overstated. Decades of fighting had devastated agriculture, disrupted trade routes, and drained treasuries. Fields lay fallow, vineyards had been burned, and countless villages reduced to ashes. For many Greek citizens, the war meant poverty, displacement, and hunger. Athens, once the wealthiest polis in Greece thanks to its empire, suffered particularly hard. The tribute of allies vanished after its defeat, and the long walls, once symbols of power, had been demolished. Merchants faced hostile seas dominated by Spartan fleets, while artisans struggled as demand for luxury goods collapsed. A city that had once boasted the glitter of the Parthenon now wrestled with debt and scarcity. Recovery, however, did come, though slowly and unevenly. As warfare subsided, trade began to revive. Athens rebuilt its walls and eventually regained some of its commercial strength, if not its empire. Agricultural production resumed, with olive oil and wine again becoming staples of Mediterranean commerce. But the scale of prosperity never quite matched the heights reached before the war. For ordinary Greeks, the war left behind a new reality. Economic insecurity was constant. Families who had once thrived as small landowners now depended on mercenary wages, debt arrangements, or migration. Many sought opportunities abroad, in colonies or foreign courts, spreading Greek culture even as they abandoned their ancestral homes. The Peloponnesian War had thus reshaped not only politics but the very fabric of Greek economic life. The dream of stability gave way to a harsher truth. Survival required adaptation in a world where wealth could vanish in the flames of war. The transformation of warfare. The Peloponnesian War was more than a clash of city-states. It was a turning point in the history of warfare itself. Before the conflict, Greek battles were often decided in short, decisive engagements between hoplite phalanxes after decades of fighting. However, war had become far more complex and far more destructive. Naval warfare took on unprecedented importance. The Athenian fleet, once the pride of Greece, had shown the potential of sea power to project influence across vast distances. Sparta, by building its own navy with Persian gold, demonstrated that even the strongest land powers had to adapt or perish. Control of the seas became as critical as victory on land. The use of sieges and fortifications also expanded dramatically. Cities no longer relied solely on open-field battles but invested heavily in walls, towers, and siege technologies. The long sieges of Plataea, Syracuse, and other cities showed how warfare now targeted not only armies but entire populations, starving them into submission. Psychological warfare and propaganda also emerged as tools. Athens and Sparta both sought to sway allies with promises, threats, and displays of strength. Even religion was weaponized, with both sides claiming divine favor for their cause. War was no longer merely a contest of soldiers, but of endurance, persuasion, and resources. In the centuries that followed, generals like Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great would inherit these lessons. The Peloponnesian War had transformed Greek warfare into something more total, paving the way for the rise of larger, more centralized powers that could sustain prolonged campaigns. Lessons for democracy. The Peloponnesian War also became a cautionary tale for democracy. Athens, once celebrated as the model of popular government, revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of rule by the people under the pressure of war. At its best, democracy allowed Athens to mobilize enormous resources. Citizens felt invested in the war effort, eager to defend their freedom and way of life. Public debate encouraged innovation, from naval strategies to ambitious building projects. The dynamism of Athens was inseparable from its democratic spirit. But at its worst, democracy fell prey to demagogues who manipulated public opinion. Leaders like Cleon and Alcibiades swayed the assembly with fiery rhetoric, pushing policies that often proved disastrous. Decisions were made hastily, with passion outweighing prudence. The Sicilian expedition, one of the greatest blunders in military history, was born of such fervor, a collective gamble driven more by pride than strategy. The war also revealed the fragility of democratic institutions under stress. Oligarchic coups briefly seized power in Athens, exploiting fear and defeat. Though democracy was restored, the cracks remained. The trial and execution of Socrates later symbolized the city's unease, a democracy struggling to reconcile freedom of thought with political insecurity. For future generations, the Peloponnesian War became a study in the dangers of unchecked democracy. Thinkers from Plato to modern historians have debated whether Athens' downfall was inevitable or the result of its own flaws. Either way, the war ensured that democracy would forever carry the lessons of hubris, division, and resilience. The cultural memory of war? The Peloponnesian War left deep scars, not only in politics and economics, but also in culture. Greek literature, drama, and history absorbed its traumas, turning the war into a lens through which later generations understood human conflict. The tragedies of Euripides, written during the war, often reflected the suffering of civilians, particularly women and children. Plays like the Trojan Women used the mythic past to comment on the cruelty of contemporary wars, reminding Athenians of the human cost of empire. Theater became both entertainment and moral reflection, a mirror for a society in crisis. Historians, above all Thucydides, sought to capture the war with ruthless honesty. His history of the Peloponnesian War refused to glorify either side, instead exposing the greed, fear, and ambition that drove events. For Thucydides, the war was not an accident but the inevitable result of human nature under pressure. His work set a standard for historical writing, shaping how the West would remember conflict for millennia. Art and sculpture, too, bore the imprint of war. While the grandeur of the Parthenon belonged to the earlier, optimistic age, the post-war era favored starker, more somber works. The optimism of Athens' golden age had given way to introspection, a culture grappling with loss. Through these cultural expressions, the Peloponnesian War lived on far beyond its final battle. It became not only history but myth, a story retold to warn, instruct, and reflect on the timeless tragedies of human ambition and conflict. Persia's shadow over Greece. The Peloponnesian War cannot be understood without acknowledging the role of Persia, the old enemy turned decisive influencer during the conflict. Both Athens and Sparta courted Persian support, each hoping to secure golden ships. The irony was striking. The very empire the Greeks had once united against at Marathon and Salamis now determined the fate of their quarrels. Sparta, in particular, benefited from Persian aid. When its land power proved insufficient against Athens' navy, Persian funding allowed it to build fleets that could challenge Athenian dominance at sea. The decisive battles that brought Athens to its knees were financed, in large part, by the great king. This dependence marked a turning point in Greek politics, showing that no city-state could remain isolated in its ambitions. Even after the war, Persia's influence lingered. Spartan envoys negotiated with Persian satraps trading Greek autonomy for resources. Persian gold became a weapon more effective than swords, buying loyalties and sowing divisions among the city-states. The proud independence of Greece was, paradoxically, eroded by the very power it had once repelled. For the Greeks, Persia's shadow was both humiliating and sobering. It revealed the vulnerability of their fragmented world, where unity was rare and self-interest constant. The Peloponnesian War had weakened Greece so profoundly that it became susceptible to foreign manipulation, a weakness that would, in time, open the door to even greater powers. In the end, Persia did not conquer Greece militarily, but it conquered in another way, by exploiting division, by funding conflict, and by ensuring that Greek energy was spent not on unity but on endless rivalry. The road to Macedonian conquest. The Peloponnesian War was over, but its consequences rippled forward into the 4th century. Sparta's brief hegemony gave way to Theban ascendancy, and Athens struggled to recover its former glory. Yet none of the old powers could maintain lasting dominance. Into this fractured landscape stepped a rising force from the North Macedon. For generations, the Macedonians had been dismissed as semi-barbarians by their southern neighbors, but under Philip II, Macedon adopted Greek military innovations. While adding new ones of its own, Philip's reformed phalanx, with its long reses combined with cavalry maneuvers to create a flexible and devastating army. Where Athens and Sparta clung to old rivalries, Macedon built strength in silence. The weakness of the Greek city-states made Philip's conquest easier. Exhausted by generations of war, unable to unite, they fell one by one. Thebes was crushed at Chaeronea, Athens submitted under terms, and Sparta, though proud, could not resist. The war that had once been framed as a struggle for Greek leadership had ultimately destroyed the possibility of Greek independence. The Peloponnesian War had thus paved the way for Macedon. It showed how division and arrogance could undo even the most powerful cities, leaving them vulnerable to outsiders. Without the decades of attrition, perhaps Athens or Sparta might have resisted Philip, but the legacy of their war ensured their submission. The rise of Macedon was not merely a shift in power, but the end of an era. Greece, once defined by the independence of its Peleus, was now a province of a greater kingdom, a prelude to the world-shaping campaigns of Alexander the Great. Cultural reflections of war. The Peloponnesian War left an indelible mark on Greek culture. It was more than a political and military disaster. It was a collective trauma that seeped into art, drama, and literature. Playwrights, poets, and historians struggled to process the human cost of decades of conflict. Euripides' tragedies, for example, reflected this societal pain. Works like The Trojan Women and Hippolytus showed the suffering of ordinary people, especially women and children, caught in the crossfire of ambition and pride. Through mythic narratives, playwrights communicated the horrors of war while questioning the morality of leaders. Drama became a mirror for a society reckoning with its own actions. Historians like Thucydides captured the war with unparalleled realism. His meticulous recording of events, speeches, and strategies emphasized human nature over divine intervention. For Thucydides, the war revealed the constant tension between fear, honor, and self-interest, lessons that have guided political thinkers for millennia. Art and sculpture also reflected the age's uncertainty. The optimism of Athens' earlier golden age gave way to darker, more introspective expressions. Victory and power were no longer celebrated blindly. Instead, the focus shifted to human experience, suffering, and the moral consequences of ambition. The Peloponnesian War, in cultural memory, became a lens through which Greeks understood themselves. It showed that even in defeat and chaos, the human spirit expressed insight, creativity, and reflection, leaving a legacy far beyond the battlefield. Persia's influence and Greek fragmentation, the war demonstrated that external powers could manipulate Greece to their advantage. Persia, once the ancient adversary of the Greeks, emerged as a silent arbiter. By funding Spartan fleets and influencing alliances, the Persian Empire subtly shaped the outcomes of Greek conflicts. Sparta, despite its battlefield victories, relied on Persian gold to maintain its naval supremacy. Athens, weakened and desperate, also navigated Persian influence in attempts to reclaim power. In this delicate dance, Persian interests guided the fates of Greek city-states without firing a single arrow. The war left Greece fragmented. Alliances shifted like sand, cities changed hands, and trust between Peleus eroded. Persia exploited these divisions, ensuring that no unified Greek force could challenge its authority in Asia Minor. The seeds of dependence and vulnerability were sown, demonstrating how internal conflict can invite external dominance. The Persian shadow reminded Greeks that military prowess alone could not guarantee security. Economic leverage, diplomacy, and strategic cunning were equally decisive. The war had changed the rules of power, showing that the battlefield was only one of many arenas in which influence was wielded. Ultimately, the Peloponnesian War did not free Greece from foreign influence. It taught harsh lessons about the fragility of independence, the cost of division, and the subtle power of manipulation. The legacy of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War ended more than 2,000 years ago, but its lessons continue to echo. It was not simply a war of spears and ships, it was a war that revealed the fragility of alliances, the dangers of hubris, and the costs of unchecked ambition. In the ashes of Athens and the hollow triumph of Sparta, later generations saw warnings for their own times. For political thinkers, the war offered insights into human nature. Thucydides' analysis of fear, honor, and interest shaped not only ancient philosophy but modern theories of international relations. His cold, unsentimental portrayal of leaders and states continues to be studied by generals, diplomats, and scholars who seek to understand why wars happen and how they unfold. For ordinary Greeks, the war meant displacement, poverty, and grief. It was not heroes and kings alone who bore the consequences, but farmers whose fields were burned, sailors lost at sea, women and children enslaved, and cities erased from the map. The human dimension of the war, captured in plays, histories, and oral traditions, ensured that its memory remained vivid. The Peloponnesian War also shaped the very identity of Greece. It ended the golden age of Athens, crippled the pride of Sparta, and opened the door to new powers. Yet in its ruins, it left cultural achievements that still endure, plays that move audiences, histories that inform, and questions that challenge us. In many ways, the war is a mirror. It reflects back to us the costs of division, the seduction of power, and the resilience of those who endure catastrophe. And so, though its battles are long past, its meaning remains alive. A story of how a civilization both soared and fell through the choices it made. Lessons for future generations. The Peloponnesian War became a cautionary tale for all who followed. Its lessons were not lost on later thinkers or rulers, who studied the conflict as a guide to both strategy and folly. One lesson was the danger of overreach. Athens, at the height of its power, sought to extend its empire too far, culminating in the disastrous Sicilian expedition. Its downfall illustrated how ambition unchecked by prudence can destroy even the most powerful states. Centuries later, empires from Rome to Britain would wrestle with the same challenge of balancing expansion with sustainability. Another lesson was the corrosive effect of internal division. Civil wars erupted within many city-states during the conflict, as oligarchs and democrats fought for control. These internal fractures often proved more destructive than the external enemy. The war showed that no state can remain strong if it is divided against itself. Perhaps the most sobering lesson was the fragile nature of democracy. Athens, the world's first democracy, was repeatedly manipulated by charismatic leaders who swayed the assembly with promises of glory. The same system that allowed citizens to govern themselves also left them vulnerable to demagogues. This tension would remain central to every democratic experiment that followed. In the end, the Peloponnesian War became not just a Greek tragedy, but a universal one. Its echoes remind us that power, unchecked ambition, and internal strife are dangers faced by all societies, ancient and modern alike. The story of the Peloponnesian War is more than a tale of swords, ships, and shattered cities. It is a story of human ambition, resilience, and the timeless consequences of division. It reminds us that power can be fleeting, that victory often comes at great cost, and that culture and knowledge endure long after the battlefield is silent. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most transformative conflicts, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to uncover more epic historical journeys. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment of the Peloponnesian War surprised you the most? And don't forget to check out our other videos exploring the battles, leaders, and civilizations that shaped our world. History is alive, and every story we explore brings the past into the present. So join us as we continue to uncover the truths, legends, and lessons hidden in the pages of time.